There was a great Rebbe who lived in Holocaust Europe, and he perished in the Holocaust, in the Warsaw Ghetto. And his name was the Piasetzner Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. He wrote many books, and several of them survived the Holocaust, and they're learned now. One is called Chovas HaTalmidim, another one is called Eish Kodesh. He also had a diary which he kept, and the diary was found after the war in the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto. And this is one passage from his diary. He writes to himself. He says, "It's my 40th birthday. He says, what would I like to do? What would I like to accomplish on my 40th birthday? He says, could it be that I would like to learn more Torah? He says, certainly I would, but it seems to me that I spend as much of my time in the study of Torah as possible. He says, could it be that I have to work more on my desires? He says, it's possible, but it seems to me that I have done that as best as I possibly can. He says, therefore, what remains for me? What remains to me at the age of 40, he writes, is Tzayin a Yid, to be a Jew. That's what I want to be. I want to be a Jew. Now, you'd figure this man was not only a Jew, but he was a great Jew, right? He was a Rebbe. He was a tzaddik. People came to him for brachos. He was a great Talmid Chacham. He had insight. He counseled people. He was enormous in his knowledge. But what's he doing? He's going deeper and deeper and deeper, so much so that he wants to fundamentally know what it means to be a Jew and to be a Jew. So he wants Tzayin to be a Jew. That's what I'm talking about, this idea that to redefine for ourselves some of the terminology of Yiddishkeit that perhaps we take for granted, words that we take for granted. And by doing that, and holding them up to the light of the Torah, we go deeper into ourselves, and deeper into our own experience as to what it means to be a Jew. I want to give you one example of that. Humility, anivus. We could study a lot about the merits of humility. Many books in the Torah and in the commentaries write about the importance of being humble. But what happens if we have a misunderstanding of what it means to be humble? So we're working on something, but it's not really it, right? Because the Torah's definition of humility might not be what we have in mind. So for example, humility in general, in literature, in society, is often identified with the person kind of putting themselves down. You knock yourselves down, and you're very, very humble. In the Jewish tradition, that's not the definition of humility. In our tradition, the concept of humility is to try to come to terms with exactly who we are. To know exactly who we are. Not to make ourselves smaller than we are, just to know who we are. And the Baal HaTanya writes that if we really had a grasp of who we were, we'd have no need to make ourselves any smaller. Because to really know how small a person is in the universe, God, right, we would be overwhelmed with the feeling of how small we are. No need to go any further than that. If we really grasped our place in the universe, we'd be very humble people. That's not about self-deprecation. It's not about knocking oneself down at all. It's not about self-degradation whatsoever. It's about the truth, who we are, what our abilities are, what our strengths are, what our limitations are. That's to be humble. How do we know this? Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher, Moses, was the greatest prophet who ever lived. He had the greatest comprehension of God, of any human being who ever walked this earth. And the Torah describes him as what? The humblest of all men, humblest of all people. Moshe Rabbeinu knew who he was. He knew he was talking to God. He knew God was talking to him. But he was humble because he understood who he was exactly. He He wasn't proud in the sense of negative pride. He understood who he was, his place in the world. That's humility. When somebody like that knows, has an inkling of how great God is, which Moshe Rabbeinu had an inkling of that, he knew how small he was. The more one knows God's greatness, the more one knows our own smallness. Well, that's on one side. On the other side is that a human being is great. There's no creation in the universe that can do what a human being does. A mitzvah is eternal. We can do something that lasts forever, literally forever. A word of Torah lasts forever. We can lift up another human being's spirit, and it can help them for the rest of their life. A human being is great. And this balance for us between how small we are and how great we are, within that lies humility, to know who we are. And we're going to have to make adjustments on that, because life is dynamic, life changes, it's not a constant. Humility for us is to grasp who we are, what we can do, what our capabilities are. And the more one knows those things on a fundamental level, the more free and the more freedom we have. Because we're not stuck on a false definition. We extricate ourselves from a false definition and try and become the real thing. That's also a type of humility. So therefore, what are we doing at the Seder? Questions, 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 more questions, questions. Why? We want to know. We're really trying to figure this out. What does it mean that God took us out of Mitzrayim? Why is this night different from any other night? What does this mean, this passage in the Haggadah? What does that mean? Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu. It's a night of questions, because we're free to ask, and we're free to discover who we really are and our real identity. And all of the structure of the Seder is in order to get us to that point. The Haggadah is much more about questions than it is about answers. There are answers in the Haggadah, but I think you walk away with more questions than you do answers. And that is good. We want to open ourselves up to what it means to be a Jew, and there's no way to do that if we're not asking questions. I mentioned to a class this morning of young ladies that I teach that the greatness of our Torah is that we are encouraged to ask questions and to grow from the questions. And Pesach is very much associated with questions. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. You start asking that when you're a little child. That's how everybody, relates to the Haggadah. The little children ask, Ma nishtana halayla hazeh, and it goes from there. What happens if there are no children at the Seder? The adults ask. How about if there's nobody there except for you? The Haggadah asks. You ask anyway. Who are you asking the questions to? Yourself, God. You're sitting in the Seder by yourself. You still say the Ma nishtana. Not only that, when the kids say the Ma nishtana at the Seder, after they're done, we're supposed to ask after them. We don't just say, okay, now the kids ask, now we go on. Ma nishtana is part of the Seder. It's part of the Haggadah, for children and for adults. So we want to open ourselves up to the experience of the Seder, of Haggadah, and that's the Man Cheruseinu.